Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, I'm going to offer up 5 practical tips for how you can have a more successful submission into a third-party grading company. And it doesn't matter what grading company you are talking about. My hope is that these tips will help some people out there, because let's face it, we've all seen those videos on YouTube where somebody is super excited, they're unboxing their comics, and then the look of disappointment and despair washes over their face as they pull out a book or many that don't quite match up with their expectations. And so my hope is that the tips that I offer up here will be helpful to the comic book community. This video is sponsored by Shortbox, the easiest way to buy and sell graded comic books. Tip number 1 is to remove the comic from the poly bag. And it doesn't matter whether this is a poly bag that you placed the comic in yourself, or if it was a poly bag that the comic came pre-sealed in from the publisher back in the day. In both cases, you want to take it out of the poly bag. And this is a question that I've received a lot. Part of it is that I think that people are concerned that the pre-sealed comic will actually lose value as a result of being removed from the poly bag. I personally have never seen that. I have never seen the value of a comic drop as a result of being removed from the poly bag. Now, there are cases where a card and comic combo has been worth some money, but in many cases, I think that that is related more to the card than it is to the comic. Because at the end of the day, if you are trying to get a comic graded, you really do not know the value of that comic until you take it out of the poly and evaluate and assess the condition of that comic. There's also no way that a grading company will grade a comic inside of a poly bag. It is literally impossible to do so. So if your goal is to submit a book in to have it graded, you have to take it out of the poly bag before you send it in. Because if you send it in, the only thing that the grading company is going to do is remove it from the poly bag, because they cannot grade something that is in a poly. And again, I personally have never seen a comic's value drop as a result of being removed from a poly bag. If you have placed a comic in a poly bag decades ago and it's been, stored away, you still want to take that comic out of the poly bag to evaluate the overall condition of that book. In both situations, just because a comic has been poly bagged does not mean that there isn't any damage present to that book. In the event of a comic that was polybagged with a card, like a trading card or a poster, those things can actually do damage to the comic because they've been, pressed down on the comic and can leave indentations. The same can be said with the seam on the back side of a polybag. It too can also do damage. A lot of comics that were polybagged also were not done so with backing board. So you could have one that is sealed in plastic but has corner dings because it wasn't treated properly, it wasn't supported by a backing board. On the other side, if you have one that you've had bagged and boarded, that doesn't mean that that comic is perfect, right? Because comics fall over and they get bent and they've been impressed from having too much pressure on them. So a poly bag is not armor, right? In any way, shape, or form. So if you have it in a poly, take it out, evaluate the comic, make sure you know what the condition is front, back, inside before you actually send that book in. Tip number 2 is to inspect the comic. And this is very much closely linked with tip number 1. By taking it out of the poly bag, you have an opportunity to evaluate the condition of that comic. You can look for the spine ticks and the corner dings and the missing pages and the indentations and impressions that may have been left from other books pressed upon it, or from trading cards, or from posters, or whatever it happens to be. So take it out of the poly bag. Evaluate it. Look at the book, front, back, inside, outside, inspect it so you know what you're getting. Look for those pressable defects and ask yourself, if I send this book in, can that pressable defect be removed? If not, what is the grade of that book? If so, what might be the grade of that book? And this is something that I actually call dirty grading. And there is a video here on the channel that goes into a lot more detail as to what a dirty grade is and how you can actually dirty grade. But this is a great way to evaluate and assess the condition of a comic before sending it in. One of the early mistakes that I made with submitting comics was that I would pull them out of my bin. I would look at the front of them. I would say, this looks good. Let me go ahead and send it in. Never having taken it out of the plastic, never having looked at the backside of the book where there potentially is a lot of damage from scuffs and from spine ticks and all of that kind of stuff. So you have to take it out. You have to look at it. You have to know what it is that you are sending in, because if you do that, you're probably going to be seeing a lot fewer surprises on the other side when that book comes back to you from the third-party grader. Tip number 3 is to look at the recent sales data and the FMV associated with the comic that you are thinking about sending in. So once you remove that comic from the poly bag, you are looking at it, you're doing your dirty grade, you're evaluating the condition of this comic, you're evaluating the pressable defects that might be present, you're evaluating whether the book does need to be pressed or not, or cleaned or not. And once you have a grade, once you have a feel for the condition of this book, you need to evaluate whether this book makes good dollars and cents, right? Whether it makes sense to actually send it in to be graded. And I say that because not all books should be graded. That is the truth of the matter. Not all books should be graded, because if you think about the cost associated with getting a book shipped, cleaned, pressed, graded, and shipped back to you, sometimes that cost is more than the actual value of the comic that you are going to be sending in. So you have to evaluate, does this make good sense for me to spend, $30 on this comic? If the value of the comic based upon the recent sales data is only $35, it potentially does not make sense. Now, there are lots of reasons why you would choose to submit a book in beyond just the dollars and cents. There's the nostalgia associated with it. There's the desire to protect something. There's the speculative value of what could happen in the future. So all of these things have to be considered and evaluated before you pull the trigger to just send a book in. Tip number 4 is to just wait. There is a desire out there among collectors to always be sending books in to be graded. And I definitely get that excitement. I, at one point, was very slab happy and slabbed everything that I could find. But that wasn't a good use of my money, to be completely honest. And so one of the things that you might want to consider is to just wait and not send a book in. So for example, if you have a comic that you're thinking about sending in, and there is no real recent sales data for that comic, then maybe you don't want to send that book in, right? So it's a relatively new book that's only been out, let's just say, a month, and there's no sales data. So you don't know really how valuable this comic is or isn't. Do you want to spend $30 to get it graded, or do you just want to wait, right? If you spend $30 and you find out that the book is only worth $20, that's not necessarily a good use of your money, and certainly not of your time, because there is a time commitment to sending that book in. There's a time period in which you're going to wait for that book to come back. Maybe not the best thing. So if there isn't a lot of sales data, you may want to wait and not send it in. If you're looking at the book and the cost is $30 and the book is $100 and your goal is to sell the book, you have to ask yourself, is that net difference a meaningful amount of money for you to make? Again, if you send it off, you have to wait for it to come back. It comes back, then you sell it, because the market could change. So do you wait until the data shows that that book is maybe valued at $200, right? Before you actually send it in? I don't know. I don't know your situation, so it's hard for me to say what you should do, but you might want to think about, should you hit the pause button and wait for more data to come in, to wait to see how the market is reacting to a comic before you send it in to be graded? So the 5th and final tip is to buy the book graded. And here's why I say that. Sometimes a comic only has value at a 9.8. And if you have a book in your possession that could be a 9.8, but you're not quite certain if it's going to be a 9.8, do you really want to roll those dice and send that book in only to have it come back at a 9.6 versus just buying a 9.8 and being done with it? And I've actually done this myself. I've had books in my possession where I want to send it in. It kind of sort of makes sense, but it only makes sense at a 9.8 level. And as I evaluate the book, I'm not quite certain whether I'm going to get a 9.8. So instead of rolling the dice and spending money unnecessarily, I just go out and buy the 9.8. That way I know that I have it and now I'm done. So this is something that you might want to consider. Not every book has to be submitted in. Not every book is going to come back at a 9.8. This is the reality of grading comics. And so potentially one good way to have a positive outcome with the submission is to not submit at all. So think about it. With that said, I'm going to wrap this video up. These are my 5 tips for how you can have a good outcome with a submission. And to some degree, another 2 of the tips were don't even submit the books. Well, technically one was don't submit. The other was pause on the submission and think about it. But again, all of this is really designed to help people have better outcomes should they choose to have books graded. As always, if you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.